10. The Bible prophesied Israel would have a new language. It was prophesied that the ancient Hebrew language our forefather Abraham and the 12 tribes of Israel once spoke was to be replaced with a new language, a purer or better language. So instead of Hebrew, Yahweh promised that a new language was to be given to the children of Israel. In Zephaniah, Yahweh explains that after the Babylonian deportations and even after Christianity would be established, the development of this language would finally come to completion, and in this new language the children of Israel collectively as one people, the Christian people, would call upon the name of Yahweh or Yeshua, Jesus Christ. Furthermore, in Isaiah, Yahweh tells us that the language would be a new tongue altogether and be as though listening to stammering lips, meaning our ancient Israelite ancestors would not be able to understand this new language. To them it would be as though they were listening to stammering lips. So what is this prophesied new language? Well, it can only be English if you include all European people who speak English as either their main or second language. Then English is by far the most widely spoken language amongst Europeans. The most modernly recognized Bible is the King James Bible, also written in English, as well as most other popular versions. So virtually every white person speaks English, or at least understands English today. Thus universally, English is that new language for the children of Israel. Therefore, if anyone claims to have revived Hebrew or to be speaking the ancient Hebrew language today, are they not denying Yahweh's prophecies? Are they not calling him a liar? Ancient Hebrew is dead, and thousands of its words are gone. They have been lost to time forever, and they will never come back. So in truth, any and all modern Hebrew languages are only bastardized versions far from the original Hebrew our ancient forefathers spoke. Yahweh never promised that it would be revived. Rather, he promised a new language altogether for his people. So the reality is that true Hebrew is dead, and English has replaced it. English is the new language for the children of Israel, and we will now show English naturally evolved out of Hebrew. First, we should explain that it is a matter of fact that languages are always changing and always evolving. Just look at Old English compared to modern English. Indeed, we would probably all struggle to understand a word of English from 1,000 years ago, and the same could be said of Old German or Old French, Old Norse or an Old Celtic language. So whilst the people stay the same, their words and languages they speak do change over time, and Hebrew was certainly no different. The language was always changing and evolving continuously over the centuries, so perhaps it was inevitable that the Israelites would be speaking a different language, i.e. English, several thousand years after the time of Abraham. So this brings us to where does ancient Hebrew actually come from? Some people might be confused and think, is it not just Egyptian hieroglyphs, or is it a Canaanite language? And the answer to both is no, and there's a lot of lies circulating that we need to clear up. So the Israelites started as just one small family of Abraham, Sarah and Isaac. Later Jacob, Isaac's son, and his family moved to Egypt, and they took their Hebrew language with them. A few generations later they had all become enslaved. Whether they already had a writing style at this point we don't know, but the Israelites whilst in Egypt developed the first ever known alphabet. The letters used in this alphabet started off as pictures, possibly inspired by the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now these pictures were actually phonograms. So what is a phonogram? They are pictures, symbols or letters with an accompanying sound. Today we use them all the time to teach children to learn to speak. So you could just use the letters of the alphabet and teach every possible sound, which is a bit more complex, or you could simplify it and just use pictures which only cover the main sounds in your vocabulary. For example, alligator could be drawn for A or the R sound, and in this case how you pronounce the first letter of the name of each picture represents the unique sound, and this is exactly what they did to create the Hebrew alphabet. So if we now look at the first letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel and Aleph. Aleph meant cattle, and it was chosen because it starts with an A. Technically Aleph was silent, but we'll explain that later on. So the letter names are actual words in Hebrew, and every letter in the Hebrew alphabet was an everyday word. They didn't just make up these names because because it sounds good. And here immediately we can see why they chose cow to represent their first letter. Obviously they were shepherds and farmers, not bankers. Bet meant house, and it started with a burst sound, so that word was chosen to represent the B. So here we can start to see that the letter pictures were drawn to represent the meanings of the letters, and it forms the basis for the first ever alphabet created. The same goes for Gimel, which was a camel, and Dalet, which was a door. For G and D, there was no C letter initially, so each letter starts with a unique sound, and the key is how you pronounce it. So each letter functions as a phonogram. So if you went through every Hebrew letter, the speech sounds they make up the Hebrew alphabet and provide the basis for all Hebrew vocabulary. So there was a logic behind it all, a plan to these pictures, and what we will find out is European languages use these exact same sounds of Hebrew still today. But it's a little bit more complicated, as the letters were also pictographs. What is a pictograph? They are symbols or images that represent an idea. Today we use them in logos all the time, but it can also be a simple symbol like a no smoking symbol. You immediately know what they mean. They are pictographs. So let's look at some Hebrew words. Firstly, the word El, which means God. So back to the first letter Aleph, although it meant cattle or oxen, the letter also represented strength, leadership, authority, which are qualities inherent in a bull. Then if we introduce another letter, the Lamed, which was a picture of a shepherd's staff. Again, the Israelites were farmers, just reiterating that. The Lamed also represented a shepherd, to lead, to protect, to teach, all qualities of a good shepherd. So the word El combines these meanings, Aleph and Lamed, making the leading shepherd, and certainly Yahweh was that. And let's take another one. If you take the fourth letter, that Dalet, the door, and combine it with Mem, which means water, you get the water that is the doorway. And this is the word Dam, which means blood, and blood certainly is the water that is the doorway to life. One last one, and this is my favorite. If you take the name Yahweh, the name of our God, it's actually spelled YHWH, which is Yud Hey Vav Hey, and these letters mean hand, behold, nail, behold. So it's talking about the crucifixion. In other words, Yahweh's name shows us that he is Christ and that he would one day die for us. So it seems there is a much deeper meaning to the Hebrew letters and the way words were formed when you properly examine them. Okay, so when we put it all together, the Hebrew letters started off as pictographs and phonograms. That's how the first ever alphabet was formed by our ancestors. And the earliest samples of Hebrew writing we found were in Egyptian copper mines, where our ancestors were enslaved by the pharaohs, which adds further proof to the whole exodus. The pictographs looked all artful and creative, but as you can imagine, they made for slow and tedious writing. A scroll or even a personal letter was a laborious undertaking. Imagine trying to write a book, it would take forever, especially when you consider they didn't even have paper back then. Either you would write into clay and then bake it in an oven, or use papyrus, which was bits of plants attached together, or parchments, which was animal skins glued together. Anyways, over time the pictures got simplified into letters. Now the letters originally tried to closely resemble those pictures they were based on. For example, the A, the Aleph picture, was a bull's head. In letter form it became an upside down A, which to some degree looked like a bull's head with ears and horns. Just look at a bull or cow's head and draw an upside down A over the top. Eventually the letters evolved into marks approximating script and no longer closely corresponded to the pictures. So again, this shows that Hebrew was continuously changing and evolving, not just the words or accents or dialects, but even the letters, the way it was written. So to continue the story of how Hebrew evolved, this small family of Jacob had grown to over 1 million people who had left Egypt and went to the lands of Canaan. Over many centuries, their language, this Hebrew alphabet, would compete with all other Adamic languages and would become the basis for all the alphabets and languages of Europe. and the Hebrew sounds carried over as well to the European languages, because we are the same people. So let's see how all that unfolded. It can be shown that all European languages have a common link to Hebrew, and this is primarily due to the early Phoenician colonization of Europe. And of course the Danaan, Dorian and Trojan migrations played their part as well. As we've mentioned, modern historians outright lie and claim that the Phoenicians were not Israelites. If they did admit that the Phoenicians were Israelites, then the ancestral connection between the Europeans and the people of the Bible would become clear. And again, as we said before, they invent maps where there's a separate Phoenician kingdom next to Israel. Now where the hell is that in the Bible? But now we'll show they go even further. Another deception was needed, that the Phoenicians and Israelites had different languages. So basically they claim Phoenicians used Phoenician and the Israelites used ancient Hebrew, which is also called Paleo Hebrew. So before the Israelites invaded the lands of Canaan, the Canaanites used cuneiform, which is a Babylonian script. Letters have been dug up and discovered which were written from the Canaanites to the Egyptians during the invasions, begging for help against the Israelite invaders, and they were written in cuneiform. So only after the Israelite invasions did Hebrew become the de facto language of the region, and Phoenician and Israelites were the same people with the same language. If today an ancient scroll or tablet was dug up and it's written in Hebrew, if it was found in Europe it's classified as Phoenician, but if it was found in Palestine then it would be classified as Paleo Hebrew. That shows you the absurdity. So as the Phoenicians and other Israelites settled in Europe, this is how gradually Greek was developed, and because, as we explained, the Ionians were already there, they also contributed to the new language as well. So now let's look at how all the European alphabets came about. The Roman historian Tacitus confirms the legend that Cadmus the Phoenician spread the Hebrew alphabet to Greece, and even goes into more depth than Herodotus, explaining that even the Etruscans in Italy based their alphabet on the alphabet brought by the Israelites. So he believed that the Phoenicians copied the Egyptians. He was ignorant of the history of the Israelites in enslavement in Egypt. He also adds more depth to Cadmus's arrival, stating that he actually came with an entire Phoenician fleet and introduced the alphabet. He goes on to state how the first Greek alphabet came about, that it started as just 16 letters and gradually evolved from there, and then that Latin was based on this, no doubt influenced by the close neighbours, the Etruscans, who were Shemites, and gradually the Latin letters also evolved. As for our ancestors, the Israelites, with the Assyrian deportations, they were no longer one united people, and as they migrated in successive waves into Europe as Scythians, Galli, Germanic people, their language is fractured into different dialects. Each Scythian Germanic tribe developed its own distinct language, the oldest recorded being the Gothic and Elder Futhark. From those came Old English, Old Anglo-Saxon, High German, Norse, etc. The oldest rune samples of Elder Futhark we got is around 150 AD. So remember, these were Germanic Israelites who brought their language with them. No doubt the Latin alphabet influenced them, but the history of the Germanic tribes' alphabet is difficult to account for, as very little history was recorded from our ancestors' perspective during that time. As for the Gothic, the oldest samples are around 400 AD. Most of the Gothic letters were taken directly from the Greek alphabet, though a few were created or modified from Latin and Futhark runes. Now as for the Celtic languages such as Old Irish and Old Welsh, they had a different path. They came from the earliest migrations of the Phoenicians to Gaul and the British Isles. That's why even today Welsh is so close to ancient Hebrew. So overall, all European languages kept the majority of the sounds used in ancient Hebrew. European languages adopted easily to the Latin alphabet because they all originated from the same mother tongue. So we will leave it here, and in part B we shall go through each Hebrew letter one by one and compare them to the European letters of the alphabet.